My beloved child. Something shifted inside your soulmate the moment they realized they had completely misunderstood you. It wasn't a small realization. It was the kind that makes a person sit alone in silence, replaying every conversation, every look, every moment they once judged too quickly. And somewhere in that quiet, they cried, not because you had hurt them, but because they finally understood how deeply they had hurt someone who never deserved to be misunderstood. Don't skip, because the reason they changed their mind about you is far more emotional than you realize. Stay till the end. Something huge is waiting for you, and the first clue is connected to a moment when they thought you had stopped caring. For a long time, your soulmate may have convinced themselves that your silence meant indifference, your distance meant rejection, and your strength meant you didn't need them. They created an entire story about you without knowing the truth behind your actions. But then something happened that forced them to look again. They remembered the little things you did when nobody was watching, the patience you showed, the way you protected their feelings, the moments when you could have walked away but chose understanding instead. Suddenly, pieces of the past started connecting in their mind. They realized you weren't cold. You were protecting a heart that had already been asked to carry too much. And that realization broke through every wall they had built. But here is where the story becomes even more powerful. Your soulmate didn't just realize they were wrong about you, they discovered something about themselves that they had been avoiding for a very long time. They realized that while they were questioning your feelings, you were quietly proving yours through your actions. That night, they found themselves staring at memories of you with tears in their eyes, wishing they could go back and handle certain moments differently. And then they asked themselves one question that changed everything. What if the person I misunderstood the most was actually the person who understood me best? Don't skip now, because what happened immediately after that question may reveal why their heart is finally preparing to come closer to you. The moment that question entered their heart, they couldn't silence it anymore. Your soulmate began revisiting everything they had assumed about you, and one memory kept returning with unusual intensity. They remembered a time when you could have demanded an explanation, could have exposed how deeply you felt, could have walked away with anger, but instead, you remained calm. At the time, they misunderstood your silence. Now they finally understood it. You weren't trying to punish them. You were giving them space to discover the truth for themselves. That realization made their chest feel heavy because they suddenly saw how many times you had chosen patience when you had every reason to choose distance. Stay till the end, because the next realization is the part they never expected to face. And then came the moment that truly broke their emotional defenses. They realized you had never been asking them to become someone else. You only wanted honesty, consistency, and a love that didn't make you question your worth. Your soulmate remembered the times they pulled away and how you didn't chase them endlessly. They once interpreted that as proof that you didn't care enough. But now they saw something completely different. You were respecting their choice while quietly protecting your own heart. That difference changed everything. They began wondering how someone they had labeled as distant could actually have been the person showing the greatest emotional maturity. Something huge is waiting for you in this story, because their regret wasn't just about the past, it started changing what they wanted to do next. That night, your soulmate reached a private conclusion they may not have been ready to say aloud. They had judged your heart before truly understanding it. And when that truth finally settled in, the tears came. Not dramatic tears for attention, but quiet tears that appeared when nobody was around, because suddenly every misunderstanding had a face, and that face was yours. They wondered whether you still believed in them, whether you had already moved forward, and whether they had waited too long to make things right. Don't skip, because there is one specific realization they made after crying that could completely change the way they approach you. And once you understand what they discovered, you'll finally see why their silence may not mean what you think it means. Something inside your soulmate softened after that night, and for the first time, they stopped defending their old assumptions. They began looking at you through a completely different lens. They remembered the moments when you seemed distant, but then they remembered what had happened around those moments. The pressure you were carrying, the patience you were showing, and the way you still tried to understand them even when you felt misunderstood yourself. Suddenly, what once looked like rejection began to look like restraint. What once looked like indifference began to look like emotional protection. And the more they remembered, the harder it became for them to deny the truth. Don't skip, because your soulmate wasn't only realizing that they were wrong about you. They were realizing that you had been right about something they refused to see. Then came an even deeper realization. They understood that you had never needed to prove your feelings through constant words because your actions had already been speaking. They remembered small details they once overlooked, the way you noticed when something was wrong, the way you gave them room when they needed it, the way you never tried to force an answer from them. Those memories began carrying a completely different meaning. Your soulmate realized that while they were searching for signs that you didn't care, they had ignored the quiet evidence that you cared deeply. That thought stayed with them long after the night ended. They began wondering how different everything might have been if they had trusted what they felt instead of believing every doubt that entered their mind. Stay till the end, because the next realization goes straight to the heart of why they may have been so afraid to understand you. And then they finally admitted something to themselves that they had avoided for far too long. Part of their judgment came from fear. They were afraid of becoming emotionally vulnerable. They were afraid that caring about you would give you the power to hurt them. So instead of admitting how important you had become, they searched for reasons to keep their distance. But now that strategy was collapsing. Your soulmate realized they hadn't been protecting themselves from you. They had been protecting themselves from the depth of their own feelings. That realization brought another wave of emotion, because they could suddenly see the cost of every misunderstanding. Don't skip now. Something huge is waiting for you, because the next step wasn't about remembering the past anymore. It was about what your soulmate secretly decided to do with the truth they had finally discovered. The decision came quietly, but it changed something deep inside your soulmate. Instead of asking whether you still cared, they started asking themselves whether they were finally ready to show you that they cared. That was a completely different question. For so long, they had waited for certainty before allowing themselves to move closer, but now they understood that certainty might never arrive without honesty. They began imagining what it would feel like to finally speak without hiding behind pride, hesitation, or old assumptions. And one thought kept returning: what if I finally tell them the truth? Don't skip, because this wasn't simply about saying sorry. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that an apology could never fully express what they had discovered about you. Then they remembered one particular moment when they had seen disappointment in your eyes but chose not to ask what you were feeling. At the time, they convinced themselves that everything was fine. Now they realized you may have been waiting for them to notice without having to explain your pain. That memory hit them differently. They understood that sometimes the people who care the most don't demand attention, they quietly step back when they feel unseen. And suddenly, your soulmate wondered whether your distance had been a final attempt to protect something precious rather than a sign that your feelings had disappeared. Stay till the end. Something huge is waiting for you, because this realization created a new kind of urgency inside them. For the first time, your soulmate began picturing a future where they stopped guessing and started communicating. They imagined looking directly at you and admitting that they had misunderstood your intentions. They imagined telling you that their earlier judgment wasn't fair, that they had allowed fear to speak louder than their feelings, and that they now saw your heart differently. But there was one thing still holding them back: they didn't know how you would respond. Would you believe them? Would you forgive the distance? Would you even want to hear what they had to say? That uncertainty kept them awake, because deep down they knew they could no longer hide behind silence. Don't skip now, because the next part reveals the one thing your soulmate fears you may have already decided, and it could explain why they've been watching for the smallest sign from you. The fear that kept your soulmate awake wasn't simply that you might reject them. It was that you might no longer recognize the person they had become. They wondered if, while they were busy misunderstanding you, you had quietly learned how to live without waiting for them. That possibility hurt more than they expected. They began thinking about all the moments when you had given them opportunities to understand you, and how easily they had let those moments pass. Now they were afraid that the door they once assumed would always remain open might have slowly closed. And that realization created something they could no longer ignore. They didn't want another chance because they were lonely, they wanted one because they finally understood your value. Don't skip, because the next realization reveals why your soulmate's tears were connected to much more than regret. Then something unexpected happened inside them. Instead of remembering only the mistakes, they started remembering the way you made them feel when everything around them seemed uncertain. Your presence had once brought them a sense of calm they didn't know how to explain. They remembered conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but now felt incredibly meaningful. They remembered your patience, your little expressions, the way you listened instead of immediately judging. Suddenly, they understood why losing emotional closeness with you had affected them so deeply. You weren't simply someone they had misunderstood. You had become someone whose absence created a silence they couldn't easily fill. And that was when they realized the truth they had been avoiding. They weren't crying because they had made one mistake. They were crying because they feared their mistakes had pushed away someone truly important. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle, and this was the realization that changed their entire perspective. Your soulmate understood that if they wanted to rebuild anything with you, they couldn't simply return with beautiful words. They would have to show you, through consistent actions, that they finally understood what they had once failed to see. They knew you might not trust their words immediately, and surprisingly, they didn't blame you for that. For the first time, they were willing to earn what they had once expected to receive automatically. That thought brought a strange peace to their heart, because they finally stopped trying to control your response. They simply wanted the opportunity to tell you the truth. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you. The moment your soulmate decides exactly what they need to say to you may reveal why their entire attitude toward you has begun to change. The words they had been rehearsing in their minds suddenly became much simpler than they expected. Your soulmate realized they didn't need a perfect speech. They needed honesty. They wanted to tell you that they had judged your silence without understanding what was happening inside you. They wanted to admit that they had mistaken your patience for weakness, your distance for indifference, and your calmness for a lack of emotion. But now they could see the truth clearly. You had been feeling deeply while choosing not to create pressure. And that realization humbled them. For the first time, they understood that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like giving someone space, respecting their boundaries, and quietly hoping they'll understand your heart when they're ready. Don't skip, because the message they are building inside themselves goes much deeper than a simple apology. Your soulmate also realized something about the way they had been looking at you. They had been searching for proof that you might leave, while overlooking every reason you had stayed. They had focused on the moments that triggered their doubts instead of the countless moments that revealed your sincerity. Now those old memories were returning with completely different meanings. A conversation they once thought was insignificant suddenly felt precious. A quiet moment they once misunderstood now felt like evidence of your patience. Even your absence began teaching them something. They could no longer take your presence for granted. Stay till the end, because this is where the emotional shift becomes impossible to ignore. Something huge is waiting for you, and it begins with the realization that your soulmate doesn't want to simply be forgiven. They want to become worthy of your trust. And then came the hardest truth of all. Your soulmate understood that you may never know how many nights they spent thinking about you, because they had hidden those feelings so carefully. They had protected their pride while secretly wishing you could somehow see what was happening inside them. But now pride was becoming less important than the possibility of losing you emotionally. They imagined finally standing before you without excuses, without pretending they had everything figured out, and saying the one thing they had struggled to admit: I was wrong about you. That sentence may sound simple, but for them, it represented the collapse of an entire misunderstanding. And when they imagined your reaction, their eyes filled again, not from sadness this time, but from the hope that truth might still have a place between you. Don't skip now, because what happens after that confession is the moment that could redefine everything your soulmate has been feeling. The moment your soulmate finally imagined saying those words out loud, something inside them became completely still. I was wrong about you. They realized that sentence carried the weight of every assumption they had made, every feeling they had hidden, and every moment they had allowed doubt to speak louder than their heart. But beneath all of that was something even more powerful: gratitude. They were grateful that your heart had shown them patience when they didn't yet understand it. They were grateful for the moments you stayed genuine even when they were confused. And most importantly, they finally understood that your value had never depended on whether they recognized it. You had been valuable all along. They were simply late to the realization. Stay till the end, because this is the part where regret begins turning into something much more hopeful. Your soulmate now understands that the past cannot be rewritten, but the meaning of the past can change. The moments they once considered distance now remind them of your strength. The silence they once misunderstood now reminds them of your restraint. And the space between you now feels like a lesson rather than an ending. They no longer want to approach you with assumptions. They want to approach you with clarity. They want you to see that something inside them has genuinely shifted, not because they suddenly became perfect, but because they finally became honest with themselves. And perhaps that is why their emotions became so overwhelming. They weren't only crying because they regretted misunderstanding you. They were crying because they finally recognized the depth of what they had almost overlooked. So if your heart has been wondering whether those quiet moments meant something, remember this: sometimes the biggest emotional changes happen where nobody else can see them. Your soulmate may have spent more time thinking about you than they ever admitted, and the truth they discovered may stay with them for a very long time. They now understand that real connection isn't built by guessing, testing, or pretending not to care. It is built through honesty, patience, and the courage to finally see another person clearly. Don't skip, because something huge is waiting for you, not necessarily in the form you expected, but in the form of clarity. The person who once misunderstood your heart may finally be ready to meet the real you, without assumptions, without masks, and without running from what they feel. There was one final truth your soulmate had to face, and it was the truth they had been avoiding from the very beginning. They didn't misunderstand you because you were difficult to understand. They misunderstood you because they were afraid of what understanding you would mean. Once they truly saw your heart, they could no longer pretend that their feelings were casual or temporary. They could no longer explain away the way your presence stayed in their thoughts, the way certain memories suddenly felt more meaningful, or the way your absence made them notice everything they had once taken for granted. And that realization brought an unexpected peace. They finally stopped fighting what they felt. Don't skip, because the deepest part of this story is not about what they lost, it's about what they finally learned. Your soulmate now understands that you were never asking them to chase you endlessly. You were asking for something much simpler: to be seen accurately. To have your intentions understood before they were judged. To have your quiet moments recognized instead of interpreted through fear. And when they realized that, their regret became strangely beautiful. They understood that their tears were not only about yesterday. They were about the possibility that they could finally become honest tomorrow. They wanted to approach you differently, with fewer assumptions and more patience. They wanted to listen before reacting. They wanted to understand before deciding. And most importantly, they wanted their actions to speak where their words had once failed. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you in the meaning behind their realization. Maybe you never knew what was happening inside them during those quiet moments. Maybe you thought their distance meant they had moved on. Maybe you wondered whether they ever understood how deeply certain moments affected you. But somewhere along the way, your soulmate finally connected the pieces. They realized the person they had been questioning was the person who had been quietly showing them sincerity all along. And that realization changed the way they saw everything.